Hello, I've been asked to do another short recording in the series on things relevant to druids and so forth. This time around, issues of what's sometimes referred to as bardic listening skills. I'm not wholly sure this really fits in with the previous things I've recorded on druidry, simply because what I'm going to talk about is not in any sense unique or peculiar to bards and either in the modern sense or in the older sense of Celtic practitioners of poetry, storytelling and so forth. What I'm going to talk about is really applicable to many cultures and many concepts, so it's not kind of specifically bardic, it's broader than that. But you'll also notice I'm quite tired and my brain is about to give in, so this is why it's slightly incoherent, more so than usual. To start with, what I want to suggest is that the skills of listening for a storyteller or a poet, shall we say, a wordsmith, a weaver, a creator of imagery within the various different pagan traditions, and I'm sure this is probably equally true for people from non-pagan spiritual traditions, Sikhs and Hindus and Buddhists and Muslims and Jews and so forth, who are doing also creating poetry and storytelling and so forth. I dare say it's an across the board issue. But talking from my own sort of background primarily, when you are bringing a story to life, when you are creating a poem that has a religious context, a poem based around gods and spirits, ancestors, spiritual figures, shall we say, in the broad sense of the word, what you're trying to do initially, if it's going to be a successful story, one that grabs the audience, or a poem that really draws people in, is create a vehicle by which the beings you're writing about can speak through you. For them to speak through you, you have to listen to them. You have to let them speak to you and then through you, so that their words are then on the page and are flowing, that they are becoming the poem you've written down or the story you're about to stand up and tell to an audience, whoever it may be that's going to listen. You need to have an idea of who and what it is you're talking about, so that you develop a link. And not all sorts of ways you can do that. You can sit and you can meditate, you can go to sacred locations, places particularly linked to those beings, and sit there and commune with the spirit of place, which is another aspect of the listening skills, in that I think in Buddhism, if I remember rightly, it's called out-sitting. There's a similar phrase in heathenry as well, the idea of out-sitting, where you go and sit outside bank of a river, in a woodland glade, on the mountainside, wherever it might be, and you sit and you're still and you're calm and you just listen. You're not expecting the booming voice of Charlton Heston to start thundering at you out of the shrubbery. Rather, what you're doing is listening to the wind, the susurration of the leaves on the trees, the gentle play of the water as it goes down a river or a stream. You're listening to the cawing of crows, the mooing of cows, the howling of wolves, whatever it may be there is to listen to. You are opening yourself to the sounds of nature and shifting your consciousness into a trance-like state, so that you can grasp the spirit that's talking to you, the spirit of the land itself, allowing that the land has something to say and a consciousness to say it with, and that you have just become, for that half hour, however long you're sitting there, period of time, part of that landscape. You may not be a regular resident or a permanent resident of it, you may just be a transitory visitor, but transitory visitors become part of the landscape they're visiting. So it's about sitting and communing and listening to what those places have to say. So if you want to, let's say you are communicating, use a random example, Abendinus is a deity, an ancient British deity associated with the Fenlands. So let's say you want to commune with Abendinus, you go to a fen, you sit in the fens, and you can say prayers to him, talk to him in a more formal sense if you wish, but then you just sit and listen. You don't need to go off into a deep trance state and so forth, just into a gentle shift of consciousness, so that you enter into a slightly different state of mind, and then you hear the voices talking to you, the voice of the birds, of the wind, of the river, the waters, so forth, and that conveys something to you, conveys an impression of welcome or of hostility, of curiosity, of nobility, or of fearfulness, of whatever it might be, but it conveys to you, and gradually you open yourself up. You might, if you have a mind that works that way, get the voices, and you can hear what it is that the presences are saying to you in very overt ways, or some people, they just get very vivid images pop up in their mind. But for other people, it just may be the sounds of the birds and the wind, and that is quite enough in itself to convey a message to the individual. That they've listened to it, and then as a poet, a storyteller, a bard, if you will, or a skald, or whatever word you want to use, with, you pass that on to somebody else. Be that a person reading your poem, be that a hall of 100 or plus people sitting and listening to your story, whatever the circumstances, you transmit the story. You become, if you will, part of that landscape that's brought to the people that are listening or reading the poem, if it's a written down thing. So that is part of the skills I'm talking about, to tune in to what other beings have to say, and then to be able to transmit that onwards to other people who are then listening to you, and they're getting a sense of the gods, the heroes, the heroines, the goddesses, the spirits of the land, what have you, that your story or your poem is about. Your audience is being drawn into that through their listening skills. Something else I'd like to quickly reflect on, because I don't have an awful lot of time, is that when you're reading stories, or you're listening to somebody else telling a story, or you're watching a TV version that's been stuffed on the telly or on YouTube or something or another, what you need to be aware of, particularly if it's one of the early written versions, I think more so, is it's not just the words that are spoken, it's also the silences, the things that are not said, particularly where you're kind of half expecting it to say something and then it doesn't say it at all. Human communication is only partly verbal. When we are sitting face to face communicating, the vast majority of what we communicate is silence. It's through body language, facial expression, and so forth. It's through what's not said as much as what is said. The English language particularly is notorious that you often say one thing and mean another, and for somebody who's only just learned English, they don't necessarily always get that. They and find it confusing that the way we use our spoken language is often totally diametrically at odds, where the semantics, the meaning, is diametrically opposed to the words. We get that as native speakers, and first-time speakers don't always pick up on those sorts of oddities, and that's part and parcel of the language. And obviously, if you're reading an account of some story that was written 1,000, 1,500 years ago, then the way people spoke then had its own understandings of silence, implied meaning, suggested meaning, hinted at meaning, which may be largely lost to a modern audience. And it's trying to get your mind gradually to shift into the set of someone who is listening as if you were in the audience when that story was first being told. Both what is the teller saying to you, or the poet saying to you, but also what they're not saying to you, and reading into the silences, which is actually quite a hard thing to do. But it's a skill you acquire through practice and practice and practice, trying to pick up on that. Having mentioned Abendinus earlier, there are a number of deities, but and I suppose this maybe is where we come back to the druidy bit, if you like, the bardic bit, in that it applies more so in this culture than it does in a number of other cultures, that because there is a paucity of written sources, the druids of old wrote nothing down themselves, and then when the Christian monks and so forth came in, they wrote quite a lot of stuff down, but not necessarily absolutely everything down. And there is always the argument that what they wrote down might have shifted and changed over time, reflected different understandings, so that the way people thought of a myth, of a story in 1000 AD was different from the way they thought of the same basic story in 100 AD, or in 200 BCE, for argument's sake. So the same story can shift and change over time as different people are telling it. But aside from the gods that are mentioned in stories, like a lot of the big Irish deities and some of the Welsh figures who may or may not be deities, there are Romano-British altar stones. Lots of them in museums, and archaeologists dig new things up all the time, where you have a name of a deity carved into a stone, and that's all you've got. There's no other context for it. It's the name that's never cropped up in any of the myths and legends that have survived to the 21st century. Presumably, if you went back in time in the TARDIS, you might hear people telling stories about that deity back then. It's highly likely. But those stories have not made it onto a manuscript, have not survived the passage of time. So we today don't know their stories. All we know is a name. And so you've got tailless gods, in the sense that we have a name for this god or goddess or whoever it may be, but that's all we've got. And from a historical, archaeological point of view, that is all you've got. Maybe you've got the context of other things that were in the same pit where the stone was dug up from. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. From a spiritual point of view, as practitioners, as people who take these gods as real rather than just names carved on altar blocks of historic interest, just because we only have a name left doesn't necessarily mean that that deity, that being, has dwindled into nothingness. Because no one has worshipped them, prayed to them, communicated with them in 2,000 odd years, does not mean that they have killed over dead or disappeared up themselves in a puff of smoke. So when it comes to nameless deities, you can take the name and use that as a starting point. So Abendinus is a good example, because all we have of Abendinus is a block of stone with his name on it that was found in the fens. There are other deities in a similar sort of context. Cocidius, for example, of whom nothing much is known beyond his name and a few scraps of things dug up from the ground. You can go to places, perhaps the place where it was dug up, if it's still accessible and hasn't been turned into a supermarket yet, or if the name is understood in terms of the meaning of the words, so that it's known. Calirius, for argument's sake, means Lord of the Hazelwoods. Dedications to him were dug up from around Colchester way. So you could go to a hazel woodlands with a lot of hazel trees. You could sit under a hazel tree. You could chant the name Calirius and then sit and be still. Maybe nothing will happen. Maybe something will happen. Maybe Calirius will hear you and think, who is this weirdo talking my name? What do they want? And then you get a sense of a link, and that link may be go away and leave me alone, or it may be talk to me some more. And if it's talk to me some more, then you can start to establish a link. If it's go away, leave me alone, my suggestion is that you go away and leave them alone. If they welcome in further dialogue, then you've got that potential to sit, to make a link, whether it is in terms of you going off into a very deep trance state and having visionary experiences, or whether it's just you sitting listening to the wind and the chirping of the birds and whatnot and getting an impression from that. But you establish that link, you listen, and then you gradually start to flesh out the deity. At some point in the distant past, if we go back to ancient Roman Britain and even earlier, before the Romans, Calirius made himself known to someone, some tribesman or tribeswoman somewhere. Calirius popped up out of the blue and said, hello, I'm Calirius, and that name was transmitted to that person, who told it to another person, who told it to another person. And it begs the question that how do we as pagans understand the revelation of stories? Where do those stories of the old Greek gods, the Norse gods, the Celtic gods, the Japanese gods, where do they come from? Obviously within Christianity and Islam and so forth, you have the notion of a deity speaking directly to certain people, and those people sometimes writing down what's said, or occasionally they tell another and tells another who tells another, and then someone somewhere along the line writes down what is said. We don't quite have that. There is no account that Zeus came down on a lightning bolt and spoke to some ancient Greek who wrote this down. They have become traditional stories. They were